I like totally just forgot.
Yes, you
Um,
did use Laggard.
I know. I got them all graded, and then this morning I was like, oh my God, I didn't send them. But yeah, so did you have any announcements or anything, Tom, before we get started?
Nope. Just
Okay.
nutrition away.
All right. Yeah, so just quick announcement about the exam. They are all graded. The average on this one was a 78. So pretty close to a B. There were 3 A's, 3 B's, 6 C's, and then I think like 2 D's and maybe an F. And one person actually got all of them correct. So you'll know who you are when you look at the grade book. Good job on that one. I'll try to go over it if I have time at the end of this lecture. If I don't have time, then I'll be posting the key later today so that you can see the answers. And if you did take it online, you should already be able to see the answers when you go in to view your attempt and any comments that I put on there. Does anybody have any questions about anything else before I get started on the lecture today? No? All good? Okay. Well, I will go ahead and pull up the lecture for today. All right. Is that up? Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about animal nutrition. And I kind of skipped around a little bit on the schedule because this is kind of like my area of expertise and I wanted to be able to give this one in person. It's probably the one I can give you the most information about, especially if you have any questions. So we will just go ahead and get started. So all animals require different nutrients for life, and actual nutrient requirements may vary some by species. And so all animals require the following nutrients: energy, protein, minerals, vitamins, and water. So the specific amounts of those that they require may differ based on species, but all animals require those categories. So first we're going to talk about energy, and there are a lot of different sources of energy. So an animal could get energy from carbohydrates, which I'm sure you've heard of. So carbohydrates are basically just kind of complex molecules, for example, like starch or cellulose. And so they can be made up of monosaccharides or disaccharides. Mono just means basically one sugar. Disaccharide basically means two sugars. So for example, lactose would be a 2-sugar molecule, and then glucose and galactose would be a 1-sugar molecule. Is kind of how you look at that. So those are what make up carbohydrates. And fats are another source of energy, and fats we'll kind of go into this a little more in detail throughout the lecture, but fats can be either monoglycerides, diglycerides, or triglycerides. And so all those mean are like 1 fatty acid, 2 fatty acids, or 3 fatty acids: mono, di, and tri. So they're kind of pretty self-explanatory in the naming. Volatile fatty acids, which we've talked about before, that are produced by what? Does anybody remember where those are produced or how they're produced?
It's the breakdown of something, but I don't remember what.
Yep. Do you know what the breakdown is happening by? So it's in the rumen in ruminants, or like the cecum in the horse. So remember we talked about the microorganisms that are in there that can actually break down the plant material that the animal can't. And so they will produce volatile fatty acids. And the 3 volatile fatty acids, which up until this point, I haven't really asked you to know the 3. We just kind of talked about volatile fatty acids in general. But the 3 main volatile fatty acids that are produced are acetic, propionic, and butyric acid. So protein in some cases can actually be a source of energy as well. It's typically not going to be a primary source. Protein will kind of be a source of energy if like you haven't eaten in a while and you haven't taken in any carbohydrates or fats. Your body may start breaking down muscle to use as energy, but so that's kind of going to be a last resort. But in carnivores, it's a little bit more important because if you remember when we talked about carnivores, carnivores are strictly meat eaters. So carnivores aren't going to really be consuming a lot of carbohydrates and things like that. They will be consuming some fats. But so in that case, protein may be kind of more of an important energy source for them as opposed to carbohydrates, if that makes sense. So proteins are the next category, and proteins are just a polymer of different amino acid residues. And so basically all polymer means is that it's kind of just a compound molecule. It's just a combination of things. And so they're just made up of different amino acids. So like I said, polymer just means that it's a substance with a molecular structure consisting of a large number of similar units that are bonded together. So it's just basically similar units that are bonded together to form a larger unit. So amino acids will be bonded together to form protein. So other protein sources would be non-protein nitrogen, which could be urea, and that is typically sometimes used in ruminant feed and can substitute a little bit of the protein there. And rumen microorganisms, so again, the microbes that live in the rumen, can actually synthesize protein from non-protein nitrogen. So instead of feeding protein directly, you can feed something like urea, and the microbes can turn it into protein that the animal can then use. And so non-protein nitrogen is ultimately digested by ruminants because of the microbes. And so I'm kind of just to start off kind of giving you like a brief overview of each of the different categories. And so we'll go more into detail about each one of them as we go through the lecture. So it'll kind of make more sense. So vitamins and minerals are also extremely essential. Animals can have a deficiency or a toxicity if nutrient requirements are not met or are in excess. So remember we talked about sheep, like with copper, they're extremely sensitive to it. They need it, but not too much. So vitamins and minerals can be kind of tricky that way. And different vitamins and different minerals can have different toxicity levels. So they're really important to understand. With vitamins, you have kind of two categories of vitamins. So you have what are called water-soluble vitamins. So these are just vitamins that are very easily absorbed into the body. And those are typically most of your B vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins have to kind of be absorbed, use it through the fat absorption process. So they actually require bile acids for absorption because bile acids are required to, in order for fat to be absorbed. So those would be like vitamins A, D, E, and K. And so they're not going to be as readily absorbed as the water-soluble vitamins will, because the water-soluble vitamins can just be readily absorbed into the body, and the fat-soluble ones have to kind of go through this longer process and require a lot more to actually be absorbed. So water is, of course, super critical. It's the main constituent of fluids of most of the organisms that are living. And this just shows you the structure of water. It's just an oxygen and then two hydrogens, H2O. That's just a kind of brief overview of the different nutrient categories. Again, we're going to go more specific into the lecture. So now we're going to just talk about really quick, just to refresh your memory, the nutritional classifications that animals can kind of fall under. So animals can be categorized by what they eat. And then, of course, as you know, the type of digestive system that they have, because you have monogastrics versus ruminants. So we've talked about all of these before, so this should be kind of familiar to you. So herbivores eat plants. So that includes the fiber of the plant. So can anybody give me an example of an herbivore?
Cows.
Yes, cows would be a good one. So omnivores are species that consume plants and grain and animals in their feed. So they eat both. So does anybody remember an omnivore that we talked about?
Dogs.
Dogs, exactly. Yep. Dogs, pigs, lots of animals are omnivores. And good job on the dogs because people like to think they're carnivores. And so then carnivores are species that fully or almost exclusively consume meat. And does anybody remember what a carnivore was that we talked about? An example?
Cats.
Cats, exactly. Yep. As you say that, my cat is like staring me down right now. She loves the computer. But Okay, so just to kind of refresh your memory on those. So now we're going to kind of dive into the different nutrient categories and where those come from a little bit more in detail. So carbohydrates, and I have CHO there because they are made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the main constituents of carbohydrates. So a lot of times you may even see someone abbreviate carbohydrates as CHO, and that's why. So they include starch, simple sugars, hemicellulose and cellulose, which would be from plants, and then pectin and lignin from plants as well. So basically, the production of carbohydrates by photosynthesis that occurs in plants is essential for all life. Plants have to have photosynthesis in order to survive, at least most of them, and all of the plants that we would be using as a source of animal feed. And so when they do photosynthesis, that's how they actually produce these carbohydrates. So glucose is the most important sugar to all animals. It's extremely important, and it is when carbohydrates are broken down pretty much to their simplest form, that's going to be glucose. It's a one sugar molecule, so it's very simple. And glucose is going to be the sugar that's going to be used for energy in the body. And we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit. But that's extremely important to know that. And so like if you know someone, for example, that's diabetic, glucose is what's coming into play there because insulin regulates glucose. And so people that have low blood sugar or high blood sugar and all of that, they're talking about glucose. That's the blood sugar that you would have heard if you know anyone that's diabetic. Just to kind of help you maybe understand what glucose is. So starch is the principal storage form of energy in plant seeds, and it's a major part of grains such as corn. So starch, when you have a corn kernel, it's going to be filled with a lot of starch because that is how they store their energy. So then when the animal eats that corn, they will be able to access that starch and use it as energy because they can break that starch down. So a little bit about how carbohydrates are kind of named, which we briefly talked about. So you basically, like I said, they're just a combination of simple sugars. So monosaccharides, so you can think of saccharides as kind of just meaning sugar. So mono would mean one. Disaccharide would be a simple sugar plus a simple sugar, so you'd have two. And then poly, if you remember back to like polyestrous, that meant many cycles. So polysaccharides just means many sugars. So it's basically a chain or a long combination of sugars. And you could have like trisaccharides, but typically once you kind of get past di on carbohydrates, I don't know why they kind of just go ahead and call it a polysaccharide. So starch contains a chain of glucose molecules. So remember, glucose is just a simple sugar that's linked by alpha linkages. And so the only reason that that's really kind of important is that I'll talk about cellulose in a second. They have different types of linkages. So basically it's just a glucose molecule, and that bond that bonds them together is called an alpha linkage just because of the position and which molecules it's actually bonding. And so this is important because starch can be broken down by amylase. If you remember back to like the very first lecture, we talked about amylase and how it initiates the digestion of starch. So amylase is extremely important because amylase can break those alpha type linkages, and that's what's in starch. So the reason this becomes important is that cellulose is exactly the same as starch. It's a chain of glucose molecules, but cellulose is linked by what are called beta linkages. So that just means that basically that what is combining those two molecules is in a different location. It's combining a different carbon with a different carbon. So it's called a beta linkage. So if it has a beta linkage, actually amylase will not be able to break that bond. So amylase will not be able to help with digestion of that molecule. So with beta linkages, like in cellulose, which comes from plants, only microbes can digest that type of linkage. So this is where the microbes in the cecum or the rumen become extremely important because without them, the animal would not be able to break these bonds that make up cellulose, and the animal couldn't use that. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of, we're getting pretty scientific in this whole section 3 of lectures, but does that kind of make sense? Any questions? Okay. So just to kind of show you what this looks like, because I like to kind of visualize it sometimes. So you have this molecule. Can everybody see my cursor? I'm guessing you can. Okay. I'm gonna be like pointing to stuff and you can't actually see what I'm doing. So this is a just simple sugar molecule. And so then, for example, if you have two of them bonded together, that could make sucrose. It could also make any of the other disaccharides. So over here we have the monosaccharides, which would be all of your sugars that are just one simple molecule. So glucose is more important, for sure. It's the big one. But you also have fructose and galactose, which are all simple sugars. So those can be combined together in different combinations to give you your disaccharides. So if you have a glucose and a glucose, then you get maltose. If you have a glucose and a fructose, you're going to get sucrose, sugar. And then if you have a glucose and a galactose, that's going to be your lactose that's found in milk, your lactose sugar. So this is just kind of showing you how that's all, how they all form monosaccharides and then disaccharides. And so how you form the disaccharides from the monosaccharides. And then as you can see, starch would be a polysaccharide because it is a much larger molecule and it's a combination of a lot of sugars. So it's a lot of glucose molecules bonded together. So feel free to stop me if you have any questions on it, because I know that it's kind of a lot. We're just kind of talking about how to name it and how to be kind of familiar with it. So we just talked about carbohydrates. So another source of energy for animals is fats and oils. And so another word for fats and oils is lipids. That's kind of what they can be called. And so lipids in animal feed are predominantly triglycerides. So triglycerides, tri means 3, and glyceride basically means fatty acid plus a glycerol. So you can kind of just think of it as fatty acid, basically, because fatty acids have a glycerol molecule attached. So you can see that'd be 3 fatty acids plus a glycerol. So phospholipids, as you may recall from the very first lecture that I did in this section when we kind of talked about cell membranes, lipids come into play in a big way because phospholipids are a type of lipid that actually make up cell membranes in all the cells. And so it's extremely important. Lipoproteins are another type, just another type of lipid. And so it's basically how it sounds. It's a lipid bonded to a protein. And so that can be used to transport lipids because they can be absorbed kind of with the protein. And so most fats and oils are predominantly triglycerides. So they're going to be 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. And the way to tell the difference between a fat and an oil is that fats are solid at room temperature and oils are liquid. Obviously, if you think about like vegetable oil or canola oil or like anything that you have in your kitchen, olive oil, those are all liquid. But any fats that you may have, like if you see like fat on bacon, that's solid. Because if your fat is not solid, then you have a giant problem. So oils are typically from plants. So like, again, vegetable oil, canola oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil. There's a lot of different oils you can have. And then fats are from animals or are the result from hydrogenation of plant oils. And so all that hydrogenation means is basically kind of a chemical thing that's taking place that's kind of changing the structure of that molecule. But so typically the rule is that oils are going to be from plants and fats are going to be from animals. So just like we just talked about with carbohydrates, you do have terminology for how you're going to name lipids, which would be your fats or your oils. So a monoglyceride, remember glyceride just means fatty acid plus a glycerol. So mono is going to mean 1, di is going to mean 2, and then tri is going to be 3 fatty acids plus a glycerol. And so this just kind of shows you in a picture. So this picture, what type of lipid would that be?
The one on the bottom?
Yeah, like this picture on the right. So how many does it have? How many chains does it look like it has? Just going horizontally.
3.
3, right. So it would be called a
triglyceride.
triglyceride, exactly. Yeah. It's very simple. It seems very complex, but it's really, really simple. So, yeah, that would be a triglyceride. Exactly right. So here in this picture, you have these blue circles are your glycerol molecules, or I think it's calling it your bond, but basically it's bonded to a glycerol. So you have these long chains. So all of this like squiggly line here, that's just your chain of your fatty acid. So now we're going to look at what that chain actually looks like. So fatty acids are long hydrocarbon chains that range from less than 10 carbons to more than 20 carbons. And so hydrocarbon just means that it's made up of hydrogen and carbon. So a lot of these words, like they kind of seem like big words, but you can kind of just look at them and break them down and kind of understand what they mean. So basically any fatty acid is going to have less than 10, or it could even have more than 20 carbons. And so then at the end, it's going to have a carboxylic acid, which is just going to be this group down here in the picture. You're just going to have a long chain of hydrogens and carbons, and then you're just going to have this carboxylic acid group at the end, which is going to have some oxygen in it. So that's just basically what the fatty acid structure looks like. And I'm not going to ask you to draw this or anything on an exam. It's kind of just to show you what it looks like. And so if you remember, carbohydrates are CHO because they're carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. You can clearly see that in this molecule, that those are the only things that are making up the fatty acids. So there are different types of fatty acids. So remember we talked about how fats are solid at room temperature and oils are liquid. So what makes that difference? If they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, what makes that difference between those two? So you have two types of fatty acids, and you have what are called saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. So saturated fatty acids basically have no double bond, and they would be solid at room temperature. So the way that I always remember that, and I still use this to keep it straight, is that saturated starts with an S. So saturated fats are solid at room temperature, because they both start with an S. If you can see, I underline the S there because maybe it doesn't help you, but it helps me keep them straight. And then I know that saturated is solid, unsaturated is not solid. So hopefully that helps. So you can kind of see from the picture, this is a saturated fatty acid. You just have exactly what we just looked at. And it has no double bonds. And so unsaturated fatty acid does have a double bond in the molecule. So if you look in this picture, you've got the same molecule, but here in the middle right there, you see two lines instead of one. That just means that there's a double bond there, and that completely changes the structure of that fatty acid. You can see it even causes it to bend. So that's what's going to actually give vegetable oils their property of being liquid at room temperature. It's all because of their structure. So an example of a saturated fatty acid, of course, would be animal fat, because we said those are solid at room temperature. And an example of an unsaturated fatty acid would be your plant oils, because they're liquid at room temperature. Does that make sense? Okay. So why are lipids added to diets and animal feeds? So they're an energy source. So when you add fats to animal feeds, you increase the energy level in the diet. And animals need energy for every sort of bodily process, to grow, to fight disease. Everything in their body requires energy. So the presence of fat in the diet also can help with the absorption of those fat-soluble vitamins, because remember I said there are some vitamins that have to be absorbed through the fat absorption process. So if you're not feeding any fat, then that process isn't happening, and you're going to have trouble getting those fat-soluble vitamins absorbed. Fats can also be added to improve flavor. And so that's definitely the case for sure, because if you think about like dogs and how much they would love to eat like steak fat or something that you give them, it definitely tastes good to animals. It can also improve the texture of the feed and the palatability of the feed. And so palatability of the feed, palatability basically just means how good it tastes and how much the animal kind of wants to eat it. It's basically how it tastes. How it tastes and what the texture is and everything kind of goes into palatability. So when fat is analyzed in feed analysis, sometimes we'll send feed analysis off to kind of get an amount of fat or amount of protein so that we kind of know, what the animal's actually getting. They just use a substance that's called ether, and that just extracts the fat. And so therefore fats are sometimes called ether extracts. And so that's just kind of important, because if you ever look at like a feed analysis report, if you ever get one back on your farm, it may not be listed as fat. It may be called ether extract. So just kind of wanted to make you aware of that. They're the same thing. So essential fatty acids are just a category of fatty acids. And essential, you have like essential, amino acids and all of these different things. Essential just means that the animal cannot actually make it in their body, so it has to be provided in the diet. So if it's a non-essential fatty acid or amino acid, then that means that it's not essential that you feed it to that animal, so that animal can actually make it in their body. So essential fatty acids cannot be made by the animal, so they have to be put in the diet. And so this is typically in non-ruminants, so they must be supplemented in non-ruminants. So the two major groups of essential fatty acids are omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids. Does anyone remember anything about omega-3s, where they come from, or what a good source of those would be?
That's fish, right?
Yep, fish. Fish is loaded with omega-3s. So now you kind of probably in that lecture had no idea what omega-3 fatty acids were, and talked about how they were good for you. So now you know they're an essential fatty acid. So you have omega-3s and you have omega-6s, and that is just based on the 3 and the 6 is just scientific where the bond is and which carbon is being bonded. That's the only thing that's really different about them. Their structure is different. So like I said, the name is based on the position of the double bond, so where that double bond occurs. So proteins are what we will talk about next. So proteins are basically a chain or polymer, because remember, polymer basically just means combination, compound molecule of amino acids. So like you have fats that are made up of fatty acids, proteins are made up of amino acids. So proteins can vary in their shape, their solubility, so that just means how well they're kind of absorbed, their chemical composition, and their physical properties. So why is protein important? What is it used for? So protein is used in a lot of different biological functions, including it can be used for structural purposes, muscle, skin, connective tissue, enzymes, hormones, receptors, and as well as nutrients in milk and eggs. So milk and eggs will definitely have different proteins in them. So proteins are extremely important as well. So there are 20 amino acids that are found in animal protein. And I'm not going to ask you to know all of them, because it's a lot. I took a whole class for an entire semester on just proteins alone, so I will not put you through that. But there are 20 of them. There's actually kind of 21 now. There's one that people are kind of starting to consider an amino acid. It's very similar to the other amino acids, but it's slightly different enough that there's kind of a disagreement about it. But so there are 20, but you may, in passing and throughout college, you may eventually hear that there are 21. So neither one of those is really wrong at this point. Some people think it's 20, some people think it's 21, because there's one that's up for debate. It's newer. So all amino acids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like carbohydrates, right? So what makes amino acids different from carbohydrates? Well, the amino acids also contain nitrogen. That's going to be your fourth element that's going to set amino acids apart. And I have that underlined there, because without the nitrogen, you have the same thing as a carbohydrate. So some will actually also contain sulfur, but that's only like 2 of the 20. And those are just called sulfur-containing amino acids. So for example, does anybody remember what the amino acid is that's really important for birds, for like feather production? Starts with an M.
Methionine.
Yep, methionine. Yep, you're very close. It's a hard word. Methionine is the one that's important for birds. Well, they're all important for birds, but it's kind of the main one. And methionine actually contains sulfur. It is one of the sulfur-containing amino acids. And so if you ever I don't know why you would, but if you're ever around feathers that have been burnt or anything, you may get a little smell of sulfur. That's from the methionine. So each amino acid consists of an amine group, a carboxyl group, and an R group. So what do those mean? So if you look at this picture, this whole molecule would be an amino acid. So the amine group, because they're called amino acids, is going to have your nitrogen, because that's what makes them an amino acid, is that nitrogen. So then your carboxyl group is just going to be a carbon and an oxygen and a hydrogen. So that molecule is just called carboxyl. And then the R group is going to be the part of the amino acid that's going to change. So every amino acid is going to have an amine group, this carbon-hydrogen center, a carboxyl group, and then they will have an R group. And that R group could be another carbon. It could be a carbon, a sulfur, a carbon. It could be whatever. That R group is going to change based on what amino acid you're talking about. But all amino acids will have the amine group, the carboxyl group, and this center group, and then they'll have some version of the R group. So R is not an actual element. I don't know what it actually stands for, but it's just, that would be like a carbon, and then you'd have your chain. But it's just kind of called the R group. So it's just the side chain that makes each amino acid unique. So if you kind of want to see that, you can Google amino acids, and you can kind of look at them if you're in the structure, which I know most of you are probably not. I was not either. So how are amino acids actually bonded together? So amino acids are bonded together by what is called a peptide bond. And so this is just a chemical bond where the carboxyl group, which is that group that I just showed you on the picture, reacts with the amino group of another amino acid, and that will release water. And so then those two amino acids will be bonded together. So if we flip back, you're going to picture that you have another amino acid over here to the left of this group. So the carboxyl on this amino acid is going to bind to the amine group on this amino acid. And then you're going to keep doing that, and then you're going to have a lot of amino acids in a chain. And so that bond is just called the peptide bond. So you can see it in this picture on here, where you see that nitrogen, so that's your amine group, and then here's your carbon and your oxygen, so that's your carboxyl group, and now they're bonded together. And when they created that bond, they just release water, because those hydrogen and oxygens have to go somewhere, and they go as water. So peptides are the term that we use when there are two or more amino acids that are joined by a peptide bond. So that's why it's called a peptide bond, because you have amino acid, amino acid. Once they're bonded together, they're called a peptide, because they're not a new molecule, they're the same individual molecules, but together they form what's called a peptide. And so peptide bond is what's holding them together. So then again, like carbohydrates, like fats, you're going to name them according to how many amino acids are in their structure. So you're going to have dipeptides. The only difference is that with protein, you're not going to have a monopeptide, because a monopeptide would be an amino acid, because you don't have a peptide unless you have a bond, and in order to have a bond, you have to have two amino acids. That kind of makes sense. I know it's a lot of information. But so dipeptides are going to be 2 amino acids, tripeptides 3, tetrapeptides are 4, but I will say I don't ever really hear anyone talk about a tetrapeptide. It's just on there so you know. But typically it's a dipeptide, a tripeptide, or a polypeptide, which again just means many, long continuous chain of an unbranched peptide chain. Does everybody feel like they kind of understand how these things are named? The mono, di, tri, poly. Do you kind of understand what that means? Okay. So again, proteins are super important. So proteins are required for all animals, but more protein is required in the feed for young, rapidly growing animals. So if you think about it, the younger animals are going to be putting down a lot of muscle. Like when you're younger, you are kind of more muscular, you're more in shape, and then as you get older, you kind of start adding more fat on top of that muscle. So if you're a young growing person or a young growing animal, protein is going to be extremely important. Protein requirements are also higher during pregnancy and lactation, and that's because if you think about it, during pregnancy, a fetus is growing, and that's going to be a rapidly growing animal, and so the mother is going to need a lot of protein to be able to kind of have that available for the growth of that fetus. And then also in lactation, because we mentioned that protein is in milk. So if an animal is lactating and producing milk for their young, they're going to need to make sure that they have enough protein to be able to do that. Because if you're not feeding them enough protein, they're going to have to pull it off of their body, and then you're going to start getting some thin animals. So it's very important. And then also organs of the body are composed primarily of proteins. So just like with fatty acids, we talked about the essential fatty acids and how they are needed and how important they are. So there are also essential amino acids. So remind me what essential means. Since we just went over it a couple slides ago. Does anybody remember what essential means? Do the animals need it in their diet or not?
Yeah.
They do, right. And so they need it in their diet because their body can't make it. So make sure that you are familiar with what essential means, because that's very important. Because if you have an animal that can't make certain amino acids or fatty acids, you need to make sure that you're supplying them in the diet. So definitely be familiar with what essential means. So essential amino acids, again, must be in the diets of non-ruminant animals, because the animal either can't synthesize them, so they can't make them in the body, or the amount that they actually make in their body is too low for their body's requirements. So there are some amino acids that animals can make a little bit of, but they don't make enough to actually meet their requirement. So they still need it in the diet. So it's kind of important to understand that. And so then you have what are called limiting amino acids. And so limiting amino acids are basically just essential amino acids that are present in the lowest concentration in the feeds as a percentage of the requirement. So basically all that means is that whatever you're feeding, the protein source that you're feeding has different amino acids in it, and animals have requirements for that amino acid. So based on what type of protein you're feeding and the requirements of the animal, there is always going to be an amino acid that is not present in high enough concentrations to meet that requirement. And that's going to change. So for example, methionine is the first limiting amino acid for poultry. That's the one that's most important to them, that they really need. They have a high requirement for it. And so compared to that requirement, it's not inadequate. It's not in adequate volumes in the diet. For pigs, it's a different one. It's lysine. So it really depends on the species and even their stage of production. But for poultry, it's always going to be methionine. And so why this is important is because this can limit the use of other amino acids, which can then limit protein synthesis. So for example, in poultry, if they don't have enough methionine in their diet, then they can no longer use the rest of the amino acids that come after that. So protein synthesis will stop whenever all the methionine is used. So you have to make sure that you understand what the limiting amino acid is for each species, and you make sure that that requirement is being met. So for example, in like pigs and poultry, because corn and soybean meal are not super high, they have some, but they don't have enough, we will actually add lysine by itself. That's an amino acid. We will add that by itself to a diet. They will add methionine to diets for chickens as a separate product. So you have your main ingredients, and then that will be added in addition to bump up those methionine levels. So rumen bypass products are another category of products that you may feed if you have cattle or dairy cattle. So they are basically nutritional products that are treated. So they will not be fermented, which just means they won't be used by the microbes in the rumen, and they will be digested in the small intestine. So remember, the microbes, the little like bacteria that are in the rumen, digest a lot of things that animal eats. So if there is something that you specifically want, they make a lot of things for the animal, but they also use a lot of nutrients for themselves. So if there's a specific protein or something that an animal needs, and it's a ruminant, you can what are called bypass products, which are going to be protected. So they're going to go through the rumen, and the microbes are not going to be able to get to them. So they will go directly to the small intestine of the animal once they go through that, and then that's where they will be absorbed. So you can have bypass protein and bypass amino acids, so you can more specifically meet the requirements of that animal. Does that kind of make sense? Kind of just keeping it protected so it can go by the microbes. And this really only comes into play if there's a kind of a specific protein or specific amino acid requirement that you need for the animal. Because remember, the microbes are already going to be producing a good amount of protein for that animal. So the advantage is that you can meet the nutrient requirements of cattle under different physiological circumstances. So for example, in lactation, when the animal is going to need a lot of protein for milk production, so in dairy cattle this would be important, and the microbes are not making enough protein, you want to give that animal extra protein, but you've got to make sure it gets by the microbes, because otherwise they might use a good amount of it. They're making some, but they're also using some. So if you need to get supplement more, you could feed this bypass amino acid and it will go directly to the animal, because you do have to worry about those microbes. In like a pig, for example, those microbes are at the end of the digestive tract. So the animal would already be able to absorb everything it needs to absorb before the microbes even get a chance at it. And that's just because of the difference of their digestive systems. Does that make sense? Remember how like the rumen kind of comes right after, that's part of the stomach. And that's where the microbes are in ruminants. But in pigs, they're in the cecum. So they're all the way at the end. So just kind of things to think about when you think about their different digestive systems and why that's important. So like I said, proteins can be used as an energy source if they're needed, or in animals that strictly eat meat. So amino acids can be converted to glucose, and they can be converted to fat and used as an energy source. So typically, when would this happen? Because like I said, carbohydrates and fats are going to be your main energy source. When you have more amino acids that are absorbed than are actually needed for protein synthesis, you're going to have, the animal only has an ability to produce so much protein and so much muscle. So when you have too much sitting around, the body's got to do something with it. So it's going to convert it to glucose and use it as energy. Or, like I mentioned earlier, if the animal is nutritionally deprived, it will start to break down protein for energy. Like if the animal hasn't had feed for 24 hours and they haven't gotten any carbs or any fats, they're going to start pulling that protein from their body muscle. So you think about if you're trying to grow, wouldn't really happen with cattle because they're on pasture, but like for pigs, if you're trying to get a pig to grow and that pig is out of feed for 24 hours, they're going to be breaking down that muscle. So you're losing growth because that animal was out of feed, because they have to use their body protein. So that's kind of when proteins come into play. There's also unavailable protein. So if feed is improperly stored, protein may be degraded or denatured, and then it is not digestible, which means it's not available to the animal. So some things that can cause that would be like heat, possibly moisture. So you always want to make sure that you have your feed, if it's going to be stored for long periods of time, that you have it stored in kind of a cool, dry area so that things in it are not going to actually start to break down and then not be available to the animal. This is also a concern with vitamins as well. Vitamins will break down if you have them they'll just break down by themselves anyway, but you always want to make sure your feed is stored in a cool, dry place if you can. So protein deficiency can happen if the animal's not getting enough protein to meet their requirements. And so this would cause the animal to have reduced or halted growth. It would cause reduced fertility in adults, the breakdown of muscle and other body proteins to meet their needs. So again, that's taking away from that animal growing. And then sources of amino acids, there are a lot of different ones, but typically just some of the bigger ones would be proteins from soybean meal, fish meal, animal plasma, which actually is not used that much anymore, because animal plasma is kind of like dried blood cells, and people kind of got concerned about transmissible diseases. And so animal plasma is not a huge one anymore. And then poultry meal is another one that would be a good source of protein. So vitamins, like we kind of mentioned, vitamins are chemicals that are required in small quantities in feed or in food for health. There are 16 vitamins that are essential for animal nutrition. Again, I'm not going to make you memorize all of them. There's a lot. The rumen microorganisms can synthesize some vitamins. So again, those microbes are extremely important. They can synthesize fatty acids, they can synthesize protein, and they can actually synthesize vitamins. So that's why you don't actually have to supplement cattle with a whole lot of things in their diet compared to how you would have to supplement a pig or poultry, for example, because they don't have these microbes in the earlier parts of their digestive system. So some animals can synthesize vitamin D in the skin when exposed to sunlight. Humans would be one of them. So if you're a person that stays inside like 99% of your life, you're probably vitamin D deficient. So whenever you go outside, you want to make sure that you are getting some sun, and when the sun hits your skin, it will actually produce vitamin D for your body. It's kind of cool. So again, like we said, there are water-soluble vitamins and there are fat-soluble vitamins. The difference is that fat-soluble obviously require fat to be absorbed. They require bile acids, and bile acids are part of the fat absorption process. The water-soluble don't require that, so they're easily absorbed into the body. They don't need to like wait for all these other steps. They can just be absorbed. However, they're poorly stored in the body, and so if you have any extra, it's going to be excreted. It's not going to hang around in the body. So that would be your B vitamins, which type of vitamin. And then your fat-soluble, they kind of require extra steps for absorption, so it takes them a little longer to actually be absorbed by the body. However, they can be stored in the body because they're fat soluble. So they could be actually stored as kind of fats are stored. So you can have reserves in your body of vitamins A, D, E, and K if you need it. And then that way, if you ever need it and you haven't eaten anything with them in there, your body does have some reserves there for you. And again, vitamin D you can get by just walking outside. So vitamin deficiencies are rare in livestock that are fed complete feeds, because if your nutritionist knows what they're doing, then their diets are going to be formulated to meet all of their nutritional needs. And so as long as you have a good nutritionist and the nutritionists are trained properly, you really should never see vitamin deficiencies. However, different things can come up. For example, one thing I currently work with, there is a feed additive that we put in to actually bind mycotoxins that basically come from moldy corn. And it started causing a problem in all these pigs. And it was found out that that product was actually binding one of the vitamins. So in the animal, it was binding these awful toxins, but it was actually binding one of the vitamins that the animal needed. So the animal couldn't actually use that vitamin, and animals were getting very sick. So now, basically, we know that if we feed that additive, we also have to supplement excess thiamine. So it's extremely important that nutritionists, and if you're ever going to go into anything with nutrition, that you understand what you're doing and how all of these things kind of work together so you don't create a deficiency. So commercial feeds will include vitamins A, D, and E for ruminants. They will include vitamins A, D, E, and K, and then all the other vitamins. So riboflavin, niacin, pantothenic acid, vitamin B12, and choline chloride for pigs and poultry. So pigs and poultry, like I said, they don't have the microbes in the earlier parts of their digestive system, so they require a lot more vitamins supplemented up front. Minerals are also another important category. So you have macro minerals and micro minerals. So macro, just think of as like macro means bigger, micro means smaller. So macro minerals are needed in large amounts. Micro minerals are needed in smaller amounts. So they're also called trace minerals because they're kind of just in trace little amounts. So some examples of macro minerals would be like calcium, because calcium is really needed for bone. Sodium, potassium, and chloride, those are needed for different body functions. I won't really get into because it's kind of too much for this class. And then microminerals are just needed in very small amounts. So that would be like your iron. If you have pigs are actually typically born iron deficient, so they always get an iron shot. Copper is a trace mineral, which we talked about with sheep. They're very sensitive to it. Zinc, manganese, selenium, and iodine are all going to be little micro minerals. And even though they are needed in small amounts, it's extremely important if they don't get them. For example, if pigs don't get their iron shot, they will become extremely anemic and they could die or they will not grow. So even though it's just a small amount, it's extremely important that you have these in there. So how are nutrient requirements of animals actually determined? How, as a nutritionist, do you know what to feed this animal? So we have what is called the NRC, or the National Research Council, does research on different species, and they produce a book that will have nutrient requirements for all livestock species, and then they also have one for horses. And so that's just based on studies that people have done in the industry to determine what the animal's requirements are. So you'll just have charts. It'll tell you if a pig is 50 pounds, it needs this much calcium. And they're kind of just baselines. Typically, we feed over what the NRC actually says that they need, just to make sure everything's clear. So, like I said, most people will typically use it as a guideline and will usually exceed what the book actually tells you need to ensure that the diet is meeting the requirements. So feed supplements are another thing that we kind of talk about with nutrition, because in addition to all of their requirements, you can have added things that can help their health or help them in a disease challenge. So these could be like prebiotics, which you may have heard of in human feed, like if you think of different things that you could eat, like, and probiotics are in yogurt. So a lot of people will eat yogurt all the time, and they talk about probiotics on the commercials. So prebiotic are basically, they're just nutrients that are designed to improve the population of the beneficial microorganisms in the intestinal tract. So you have those microorganisms in the digestive tract. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. So you want to make sure that that balance is always kind of a good balance. And so prebiotics and probiotics will kind of help the populations of the good bacteria that are most beneficial to you or the animal. So prebiotics are kind of like a supplement to feed the microorganisms. Probiotics are actually feeding beneficial microorganisms. So if you eat yogurt, you are actually eating some microorganisms in that yogurt. They're probiotics. So you're eating some lactobacillus organisms and things like that. But they're super minuscule and they're microscopic, but they're to actually help you. And so they are added to feed our food, and they're also called direct fed microbials. And I will try not to talk about that a lot, because that was actually my entire 3.5 years of my PhD research was on direct fed microbials. So if you ever have any questions about those whatsoever, feel free to let me know, and I have a 155-page paper you can read. So enzymes are another additive. They're just basically biological catalysts. They kind of accelerate chemical reactions. So for example, I think I actually have a slide about this, but phytase, animals cannot always break down everything in the corn that's holding the phosphorus. So phytase is an enzyme that we can add to the feed that can help that animal break it down. So it's basically just kind of supplying enzymes that the animal doesn't make itself to help them better break down the feed. Organic acids can also be fed, and that is to lower the actual pH of the gastrointestinal tract. And this is because if the pH is lower, it can actually inhibit pathogen growth. So that can be really important. And I thought I had a slide on this. So phytase is extremely important for pigs and poultry. In some feed ingredients, phosphorus, which is a mineral, is stored in an unavailable form known as phytate. So when it's fed to animals, phytate can actually bond with other minerals and even some amino acids. And when phytate bonds with these amino acids and minerals, it makes them unavailable to the animal, because the animal cannot break down phytate by itself. So phytases are enzymes that are added to pig and poultry diets that can break down this phytate molecule, which then makes the phosphorus in the grain more available to the animals. It makes it more available, and it prevents this molecule from binding minerals and other amino acids. So it's extremely important. So phytase makes more phosphorus available for utilization by the animal, which in turn means that less is actually excreted into the environment. So that's extremely important, because when it comes to waste management and environmental impact of agriculture, people get in an uproar about it. And so it's very important that in nutrition, you're considering that what you're feeding that animal, whatever they don't use is going to go back into the environment. And you don't want a lot of extra phosphorus in the environment. So phytase is one way to take care of that. It helps the animal absorb it. That makes sense? Okay. So you may have heard me mention like a mycotoxin binder, and you probably had no idea what that was. So now we're going to talk a little bit about mycotoxins because they're extremely important in animal feed. So basically, mycotoxins are toxic plants and fungal toxins. And so fungi produce mycotoxins, which are found in moldy grain. So you can see this picture of some corn that's molded, like maybe it got super wet, there was a lot of rain during the growing season, what have you. Any of that can cause moldy corn. It was stored in a place that was too hot. Lots of mold grew. So if you have any corn like this, even if you actually grow corn yourself and then feed it to your own animals, if you see any corn like this, that corn has got mycotoxins, and that's going to be very bad for your animal. It's going to slow their production down, and it can make them very sick. There are a lot of different mycotoxins that you can have, and they kind of all impact the animal in different ways. So like I said, the contaminants will have negative effects on animals that are consuming that grain. So just to kind of briefly, I'm not going to spend too much time on these because you don't really need to know all the specifics of each of these, but just to kind of show you the different mycotoxins. Aflatoxins are the big one. They are most commonly occurring mycotoxins in feedstuffs, including in corn. Worldwide, aflatoxins are the really, really big one. So the FDA actually has levels of aflatoxins that you cannot pass in the feed. So like if I know they're in corn, I can only put so much of that corn in the diet because I can't go past that level according to FDA regulations because it's that big of a deal. So ergot are another category, and that's just basically fungus. They're produced by funguses or fungi that are found on wheat, barley, sorghum, and other grasses. And it can actually attack the central nervous system and cause a lot of problems there. Endophyte fungi is another mycotoxin that's produced in tall fescue grasses. So this is something that you want to watch if you have horses or cattle that are out on pasture, if you have any fescue. So it can cause reproductive problems for pregnant horses, and then fescue toxicosis in cattle, which can be a really big thing. So you always want to make sure that if you have any fescue, that you want to make sure that you get it tested periodically and make sure you don't have any mycotoxins, or if you do, how to handle them. Humonicins are another common one that's found in corn. Ingestion of it can actually be fatal in horses if they get more than 10 parts per million, and it will reduce the efficiency of growth in pigs. And so what we feed pigs and poultry, we always have probably some little version of mycotoxins in there. So we just have to be aware of the growing season, what happened when that corn was being produced, how many are in there, and what products can we put in there to try to bind them so that they don't actually affect the animal. But animals can handle a little bit of these, but when it gets to be too much, they can't, and you need to do something. Zearalenone is another one that can basically just cause reproductive problems, especially in pigs. So how do we avoid mycotoxin contamination? So grains are tested for mycotoxin concentrations to ensure that the contamination is below the FDA acceptable limit. So if you have a feed mill and you have trucks bringing in corn, that corn is going to be tested for mycotoxins so that the producer or the nutritionist knows how many mycotoxins, what type are there, and they can better formulate so that that animal can hopefully not have to deal with a lot. So the addition of clays to feed may adsorb to the mycotoxin and make them unavailable. So the clays can kind of like cover up the mycotoxin, and then they will make it unavailable for the animal to absorb, and that will prevent it from making the animal sick. Enzymes can also claim that they can deactivate specific mycotoxins. I've probably seen more of the feeding the clay than I have feeding the enzymes, but there are people that say that enzymes can target specific mycotoxins. The toxic plants are another concern. Many plants will produce chemicals that are toxic to animals. These toxic compounds are called phytotoxins. And so these would just be like various hemlock species, leaves of rhubarb, red maple leaves for horses, black berry leaves. You can kind of see that whole list. So if you have any cows or horses that are out on pasture, you want to make sure that you don't have any of these plants around where they can access them or eat them, because it could cause a lot of problems if the animals are actually able to eat these. So we talked about energy and we talked about protein. So where do the animals actually get that? Because we're not like, we're not just feeding carbon, we're feeding it as something. And so corn is the most popular energy source for pigs and poultry. Sorghum, oats, barley, and wheat are other sources. There's other cereal grains, citrus and other pulps, spoiled fruits and vegetables, and outdated human food, which is actually very, very true. I have some pigs now that I feed that actually get bakery byproduct meal, and it's a lot of cookies. So it's like cookies that are all ground up into a meal, and they get to eat those. So a lot of food like breads and things like that can actually go to livestock production. Protein sources, you have your plant sources of protein, which would be like your soybean meal. You also have animal-derived protein, which could be fish meal or poultry meal. And then you have bacterial or other microorganisms proteins. Remember, I said those microbes can produce protein, especially in ruminants. You have synthetic amino acids where you can supplement them individually. So remember, I said like in pigs and poultry, in the diets, we'll actually add lysine and methionine by themselves. They're just the amino acids, and we will add them as additional supplements to make sure we're meeting requirements. Non-protein nitrogen, again, especially in ruminants, rumen microbes can synthesize amino acids from that non-protein nitrogen. So lots of different ways they can get it. Legumes are plants that can fix atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia and nitrate. So these can actually be incorporated into amino acids, proteins, and other nitrogenous compounds. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria actually live in the root system of these plants, and they have a symbiotic relationship, which means that it's beneficial to the bacteria and to the plant. So seeds of legumes can be used in animal feeds and will have a lot of nitrogen. So that would be, which would be protein. Nitrogen makes up protein. So that would be like soybeans, alfalfa, beans, clovers, and peas would be some examples. So ruminant feed, there are three main types that you need, three main categories of feed that you would need for ruminants. So you would need forage, which would be your high fiber feeds. That includes hay, silage, pasture, or rangeland. Concentrates, which would be grain that is ground and then fed as a kind of a meal, like a powder. Or you could actually have it as pellets. Pellets will kind of improve the palatability of it, and the animal will get kind of more complete nutrition with every pellet that they eat. Animal proteins such as fish meal, blood meal, bone meal, protein derived from rendering, so like from a processing facility of other animals, dried skin or whole milk, and feather meal. And then salt, like a salt block that you may put out for your cattle, would contain your trace elements, so your trace minerals and things like that they need. So there are also animal feed byproducts, and so those are just products that come from the processing of corn or other grains. So wet milling would be a process that corn would be put through. So the kernels would basically just be steeped in water. Then during the milling process, the starch will be removed into that water and concentrated. And I actually have a producer that feeds corn steep water in his feed as an ingredient. Corn gluten feed is a byproduct of this wet milling. So you're wet milling the corn to try to get your end product. And in that process, corn gluten feed is a byproduct. And so that actually contains protein and digestible fiber. So we can feed that to the animal. When corn is dry milled, it can be ground and used directly in the feed. So we do feed just regular ground up corn. Smaller particle sizes are more easily digested. And then distillers' grains with solubles or DDGs are protein and energy sources, and they are a byproduct of the dry milling process. And we do feed a lot of DDGs. They're cheaper than corn. Typically, like they can actually replace some corn in the diet, and they can lower the cost of the diet. So the impact of bioenergy on animal feed. So that means like, how does ethanol production impact animal feed? So starch that comes from milling is used as a chemical feedstock for fermentation to produce ethanol. So the animals that we feed need starch, but people that are producing ethanol also need starch. So ethanol is used as a fuel in a 10% blend with gasoline or an 80% blend. And so there is a tendency to increase the dry milling process due to the greater efficiency in ethanol production. So ethanol production is likely to exceed 6 billion gallons in 2007 or 2008. So it's probably already done that. That's a little bit dated. And so what this does is this actually increases corn prices for people that are trying to feed animals. Because sometimes if a farmer has corn, he might be able to get more money for that corn if he sends it to an ethanol plant versus selling it to a farmer. So if you're competing with an ethanol plant to get that corn and you want good corn for your animals, then you may be looking at higher corn prices. So it's kind of a big thing that can impact producers in certain areas. So more readily available byproducts such as DDGs with solubles are available, but again, we can use them, but there are limitations on how much you can actually use just for quality and taste of the feed and things like that. So a lot of people have increased their acreage that has been used to plant corn and decreased the amount that they're using for soybean meal because people that are growing corn can sell it for ethanol as well. So there are different nutrition calculations that you kind of just need to be aware of. And so I'll try to keep them like pretty simple, but you kind of need to know like if you have any animals and you get feed analysis back or anything, if it's on a dry matter or as fed basis. So dry matter basis just means that it's dry. So that feed is not counting the water. So just to figure out what your dry matter would be, you would just do 100%, because that's 100% is everything, minus the percent water. So like if you got an analysis back and it told you that your feed was 10% water, your dry matter would be 90%, because it's just 100% minus the water, which would be 10 in that example, and that would be 90. On an as-fed basis, if you ever get analysis back on an as-fed basis, that means that, yep.
We can't hear you.
Oh.
Okay, you're back now.
I'm back? Okay.
Yes.
Where'd you lose me?
Oh, just for a couple seconds, your screen went black, and I thought I was having a stroke.
Oh, okay. I didn't even notice anything on my end.
I didn't notice anything either.
Oh,
Oh, it
maybe.
did the other day. It may have just been our location then, but it just went black for about 5 seconds. So.
Oh, okay. You scared me because you're like, oh, and I was like, oh God, what happened? So as fed basis just means that it includes the water, so it's exactly how it's being fed to the animal. So when you're looking at analysis of a nutrient, the percentage of that nutrient on a dry matter basis will always be higher than on an as fed basis because it has no water in it, so the nutrient's going to be more concentrated. So on the other side of things, the amount of feed on a dry matter basis will always be lower because the water is in there, and so that's kind of more diluted. So comparing and converting between dry matter and as fed, you probably really won't have to do this too much, but just so if you know, if you ever have like feed analysis sheets come back, this slide is basically just to kind of show you how to do that. So to convert feed data, those are the calculations you would use. And then convert amounts of feed, that's kind of how you would do it. So basically, if you want to find out what it would be as fed, you would divide by the dry matter, or to go from as fed to dry matter, you would multiply by the percent dry matter, and then to go the other way, you would divide. But I'm not really going to spend too much time on these because they're kind of a little bit complicated to understand. And so I kind of just want to show them to you in case you need them for anything that you may do in the future. But they're kind of a little complicated to kind of get into, I think, for intro. So we may kind of come back and I may try to explain these a little bit more, but I don't want to waste too much time on them because they do get a little confusing. And I remember when I learned them in college, it was kind of confusing for a while. So these are kind of more there for like your information and for you to look at if you ever need them. But I'm not going to ask you to like memorize these calculations. So the Pearson square is something that I would like to actually have you know how to do, because it's a little bit simpler and it's easier to kind of handle and work with, and it can be really helpful. So the Pearson square is basically designed for simple rations. So you'll kind of see what I mean on the next slide. But so basically you're going to end up drawing a square to kind of do these calculations. So the numbers on the left of the square, which you'll see what I mean in a minute, must be expressed on the same basis. So you need to either be working with all dry matter numbers or all as-fed numbers. The middle number must be a number between the numbers on the left, and you'll see what I mean in a second. And then you're not going to worry about negative numbers, only use a difference. And then you're going to subtract diagonally. So let me just kind of show you, because I know that doesn't make any sense unless you're looking at it. So here's an example. So what you use the Pearson square for is if you have like 2 ingredients and you want to create a diet that has a certain amount of, let's say, protein using those 2 ingredients, and you know how much protein is in those 2 ingredients. This is how you do it. So you're going to set up your square. So you want to target, like in this example, a protein concentration of 25.5%. That's your target. So you're going to put that in the middle of the square. So your 2 ingredients are barley and soybean meal in this example. So barley is 11%, CP just means crude protein. Soybean meal is 44% crude protein. So one of the rules in order for the square to work and for you to use it is that the number you're aiming for has to be between the numbers of the 2 ingredients. So you see how 25 is between 11 and 44. Because, for example, if you have like 50, neither one of those ingredients contain 50% protein. No combination of those is going to give you 50%. So it has to be between the numbers of the 2 ingredients. So then to figure this out and to use the square, all you do is you find the difference. You go diagonally, so you see how these arrows are going. So you would find the difference between 11 and 25.5, which would be 14.5. So you're going to go diagonally down. And then you find the difference between 44 and 25.5, and you just take that diagonally up. So remember, you ignore negative numbers. So of course, if you do 11 minus 25.5, that would technically give you negative 14. But we don't need to worry about that. We just want the difference between those 2 numbers. Does that make sense? So you're going to find the difference diagonally, as the arrows show. But then when you carry the names over, you're going to carry the names of the ingredients straight across. So barley is going to go straight across. Soybean meal is going to go straight across. But you're going to find the difference diagonally. It's a lot to kind of learn at first. Once you do a couple, you'll get familiar with it, and you'll kind of get familiar with the order. But it's a very useful tool. So try to familiarize yourself with this slide, because on some of the other lectures that are going to be coming after this, I will go through examples with you. And I have a couple examples in the morning that I would go through and talk about to make sure that you're practicing the Pearson square, because there's a very good chance the Pearson square is going to be on your test. So make sure that you understand it. And so then once you have these numbers, once you've found the difference, you can add them. So you get 33 when you add 18.5 and 14.5. So then if you wanted to find what percentage of each ingredient you need, you would just do, you know that you need 18.5 parts barley, and your total is 33. So to get a percentage, you're just going to do that 18.5 divided by your total, and then multiply by 100 to give you a percentage. Same thing for soybean meal. You're going to do the 14.5 divided by 33, multiply by 100, and you get the percentage. So it's just the individual amount divided by the total times 100. So that will give you your individual percentages. And then a way to check yourself is add those percentages, and they should come out to 100. Based on your decimals, it may come out to like 99.9 or something, depending on how you round it, but they should come out to 100. So I know I went through that kind of fast, but does that make sense to everybody how I explained it? Do you want me to kind of explain it again? Do you have any questions about it? Feel free to speak up, because this will be, I know for a fact that this is going to be on your exam. So you're going to need to be familiar with the Pearson square, and it's got several parts, so it's going to be worth several points. So I really want to make sure that everybody understands how to use this, because I'm kind of letting you off the hook on the other calculations because I think they're kind of a little bit more confusing. This is a little bit easier. So I do want you to understand how to use the Pearson square. So does that kind of make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll just give a hint. This is a thing that a lot of people have struggled with in the past. So
Yes.
we will be practicing these over the next few days, but
Yeah.
practice. Don't wait until the night before the test to try to mess
Yeah.
with it.
Definitely don't, because you want to get it in your head that you find the difference diagonally and then you carry the ingredient straight across. What I typically find is that most people know how to use the square and set up the numbers, but what they'll make a simple mistake, like they will take barley and carry it down diagonally instead of across. That's a really common, that's the main mistake that I see with the Pearson square, is that people will move the ingredient name to the wrong place. So just kind of familiarize yourself with this slide. Practice. You can set it up at home. You can go online and do practice Pearson square problems. We'll be practicing them some in class. But make sure you understand how to do this. And it's a simple way that you can kind of solve a nutrition problem for yourself. So with that, definitely practice it. We'll be going over it some in class. But I try not throughout the semester to have you know too many calculations, but this is one of them that I would like you to be able to do. So any questions on this lecture or anything else in general? Everybody good? I know it was a lot. It was a long lecture. It was a lot to take in, a lot of information. I highly recommend that after class or before the next class, you go through these slides. Like just take like 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, and go through these slides, because section 3 is a lot of information and you are not going to be able to study this all the night before the exam. So just kind of go through them as much as you can. If you have any questions and you have the book, go to the book as an additional resource, but definitely be going over these slides on a weekly basis, because you are going to find that this test is going to be very hard and you can't study all of this the night before. So go through your notes, and that way you can email me if you have any questions on anything. If you don't want to ask me in class, feel free to email me anything. And definitely go over all of these PowerPoints whenever you get the chance, because it's a lot of information to take in. Okay? All right. Well, with that, I am done, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.